Mm.
So, Josh, I imagine you're familiar with this, but
I
I
studied
wanted
with Paul.
yeah, absolutely. And I wasn't sure if you were kind of connected. I know you were heading up AILA at the time, or heading up, at least the sort of advisory panel. But I just wanted to do a welcome to, well, sorry, an acknowledgement of country, and yeah, just acknowledge and respect the traditional custodians of the land and waters, and their unique ability to care for country and deep spiritual connection. I'm calling in from Bondi, beautiful Bondi. That is the sits on the land of the Bidjigal and Gadigal people, and a number of you would be calling in from the Callahan campus, which is the Awapakul people, which is located there. And this, some of you may not be familiar with the AILA RAP plan, but this artwork was commissioned for the front cover of that, and it acknowledges, or it illustrates, the 65,000 years of Aboriginal, or longer now, of what they're of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, and the 200 years of non-Indigenous cultures. And I think it's a really, there's a lot to digest in that, but I think it really talks with what we're talking about today, with this idea of time. And I think we're looking at, we design it in such an ancient land, and I think it's really important to kind of come back to how we respond to time, and how we kind of look at design that isn't just for the years that we're on Earth, but hopefully something beyond that. And certainly this idea of custodianship has been embedded within my studio. So on that, the format for today really will be a bit of an introduction to the studio, and talking about some of the students' work. They just submitted, Josh, the assignment number 2. It will be great. I'm sure they've got some burning questions for you. I shot a couple through.
Yeah, a few tricky ones, few interesting ones.
Yeah.
Lots to unpack.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Nick was very vocal, and I'm sure he's probably got some ones for that open discussion as well. Secondly, we'll get a bit of a talk from you, Josh, around these concepts that we were speaking about earlier in the week and last week, around growth, change, and temporality. And then some questions. We'll open it up, questions from the class, and lastly a workshop, and then just tie it in with some closing thoughts. But for the students who aren't in my studio, who are kind of calling in, you were probably kind of had that introduction where we all got up and spoke about our studios. But the studio Ghost in the Shell really is kind of looking at this idea of these mega structures that are littered around the East Coast, and really, I guess the students are looking at this idea of change, and that's what we'll be talking to today. So change. I guess the site that they're looking at is in Waverley, is located around Bondi Junction's Westfield, Centennial Park, and Entertainment Quarter. And this is I know it says Carriage Works, which is actually incorrectly labelled, but that's the side of the Westfield that sits there now. It's not to say that is wrong, but it's just as a departure point for Josh's talk. I think the greenest building is the one that's already there, and that's why the students have been looking at what these large structures will be in the kind of 20, 50, 100-year time. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Josh. So this is Josh. His fields of research really center on landscape architecture, sustainable development, urban design, and landscape planning. And interestingly, Josh has worked both at UNSW as a sessional and now a senior lecturer, and McGregor Coxall, which was my actual old firm. So I feel like I'm following a sort of similar path to him. But Josh is a registered landscape architect and CNTR senior lecturer at UNSW. Over 14 years of academic experience, previously holding positions of lecturer at Deakin University. He has published a great many contributions to journals and publications such as Landscape Architecture Australia. His most I guess notable readings are his 2 books, and one in particular I think we've, as of today, got access to on the University of Newcastle database, is his book, Landscape Architecture and Environmental Sustainability, Creating Positive Change Through Design. And that is something that is actually up on the course Moodle, course Blackboard now. So I'll hand over to you, Josh, and maybe can I have a bit of an introduction to your fields of research, some of these readings, and then we can have a discussion. Was that okay with you?
Great. Yeah, let's roll.
Great. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Okay, cool. I'll share mine. And yes, thank you for having me and inviting me here. And thank you to all of you for coming along today. It's always a privilege and an honor to speak to an audience. And you know, we started out with the brief that I didn't want to talk about myself too much today. And I wanted to try and help you all and where you're at. And that's why we've sort of got a bit of a split session here as a workshop. But we'll see how we go. It's always a challenge to rein me in from speaking. So I'm just trying to get my screen to share. It's wanting me to open preferences or something. Just give me 2 seconds.
And I think on that, Josh, this talk is at a really good time for the students because they have submitted assignment 2, and they're very much in the throes of having done some iterative spatial design, but starting to kind of drill down more into what they're going to present as that penultimate assignment number 3. So. I'm sure that they will have some questions for you on their work.
Alex, I've just got a notification saying I got to quit Zoom for it to share my screen. So I might just disappear and come back in, and hopefully it will allow me to do it. So just give me 30 seconds. Apologies.
Yeah, no worries. Think while Josh is reconnecting and firing up his screen share, I just want to say thank you to those students who have done the readings and sent through some of those questions. It's really, I think it's really good to be targeted, and these talks are very much to help not just expand your thinking, but also for your studio projects. So don't be sort of bent over backwards to be forwards in these presentations.
How's that, Alex?
That's great. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I can see you in the side. So thanks so much for having me, and Alex, fantastic that you recognized Ghana country. That I'm on here today. So yeah, credit for that, which is great. And so, like I mentioned, Alex wanted me to come in, and I said, look, I don't want to talk to all these topics that are sort of, you know, too peripheral or out of the timing of your studio. And anyway, we had a good conversation. We talked about your studio, and we decided that, you know, just a few small topics here that I'm going to cover off on today, as you can see. And as I mentioned, I'll try not to talk for too long. And thank you already for submitting some questions. I look forward to the discussion. And you know, anyone feel free to interrupt me at any point along the way. As I mentioned, I didn't really want to come here and talk about myself, but both Alex and Irene said, please do at least give yourself a bit of an introduction. And thanks to Alex for the introduction already. So I don't know how that font's there, probably a little bit small, but yeah, I'm a landscape architect, sort of urban designer. But I studied architecture both, well, yeah, Bachelor of Architecture, and then upgraded it to a Master of Architecture. I worked briefly at Peter Stutchbury Architecture for a while, but I pretty quickly went into public domain, because that's where I guess my passions or interests really lie. So yeah, this is the outline of the next half an hour or so. I'm going to fly through a lot of these things, and we can sort of, you know, buckle up and we can have a chat or unpack some things at the end. But so yeah, as Alex mentioned, I worked at McGregor Coxall for about 4 years, and it was really great. We worked on some fantastic public domain projects like these here, Ballast Point Park and National Gallery in Canberra, big public domain project, Green Square Town Centre. I also worked for Taylor Cullity Lethlean, a landscape architecture urban design firm, and again on some really fantastic projects, both built and sort of exploratory projects. And at both of those practices, I had the remit of the sort of environmental person, manager, or whatever role, the one that tried to keep everyone on board with that message. And some of those themes are going to come through today. And look, I'm pretty conscious of showing these old, you know, some of these are 15 years old, these graphics and images, and all I can say is that, hey, they were cutting edge at the time, even though they probably look pretty outdated now. But yeah, as Alex mentioned, sort of after the GFC in 2008, you know, practice did get a bit tough, or a bit sort of understimulating. So I went into academia, which means sort of publish or perish. And even though I'm probably more of a creative design sort of person, spend most of my time writing. How did that happen? And I don't think I write particularly well. But so the book on the left that Alex mentioned, I forgot to put a link. There's a link to a free companion website with a whole bunch of material on there, interviews, questions, projects, you know, YouTube links, all that kind of stuff. So if it's not in the library, yeah, it's called a companion website. If you just Google that, it will come up, or I can send a link through. The book on the right is a bit more of a scholarly book, so probably a bit more boring. It's for researchers. You know, if you're doing a Master of Philosophy, like Alex, I think is planning on doing, or a PhD, and you have a particular focused area. There's 4 chapters in that. It's an edited book with 53 contributors around the world. So yeah, they're the 2 main things. To quote Richard Weller, who's a fantastic professor in the discipline of landscape architecture, you sort of got to get out there and bang on your pots and pans, and you don't really know whether anyone's listening or not in the process. But you know, I've been pretty fortunate to I guess have had been given a voice from, you know, not that long after graduating, and you know, advocate for largely for sort of built environment sustainability. I won't talk about this too much, but I just wanted to, I guess, acknowledge that, you know, in design, and particularly in public domain design, which is where my career has focused, it's a very collaborative process. It's not necessarily about the individual, it's about working in a team. And, you know, that's not always easy, but it's rewarding when you get it right. And it's interesting. I'm trying to finish a book at the moment on Sydney's past food landscapes. So I've mapping all the past food producing landscapes from like the colonial or invasion era, so 1788 to 2020. That's been a multi-year process that is much bigger and longer than I would have hoped. And I've also got a research grant. Don't really like the title here, but I'm exploring future scenarios for Australia's agricultural systems and landscapes to 2050. So it's sort of like a huge, complex project and process, but at the same time, that sort of complexity is, really stimulating. So yeah, and a real privilege to be spending time on that. So enough about me. Now on to the small topics that we're going to talk about today, and starting with time. So does anyone know what this is? Is the chat functions available, Alex?
Sorry, yes, it is available, Josh. And yeah, guys, feel free to, if you are a little bit kind of nervous about cutting Josh off, which you shouldn't be.
No, definitely not. I'd prefer you to cut me off than to just hear my own voice. Yeah.
Well, Tim Greentree has gone off mute. Tim, have you got a question? No, he's gone on mute.
Oh yeah, so I thought I'd start with this. We're talking about time here, and I noticed in your course outline that Alex has given you, he talks about the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene, depending on where you are and how you pronounce it. So this is the geological time scale, and I think it's a really fantastic drawing of that. The different epochs in the geological time scale. And so, Alex, have you talked about the Anthropocene with the students a little bit? But
lightly touched on it. Madeline's just said that's a really interesting timeline graphic. They haven't, there's been a few, I guess, readings and lectures from Richard Weller talking through the sort of geological meaning of it. But yeah, if you could talk to just what that means, that would be
great. Okay, yeah. So I mean, in effect, these two gentlemen, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stomier, coined the concept or the term in the year 2000. And it's this idea that human activities have reshaped the planetary equilibrium to the extent that it warrants an entire new epoch, which is called the Anthropocene. Now, geologists, being geologists, dealing in hundreds of millions and billions of year timeframes, haven't come to the party apparently and actually officially, sanctioned this concept and drawn the new segment here on the diagram. But that's sort of, in terms of time in hundreds of millions, billions of years, that's sort of where we find ourselves. Has anyone read this book? Looking to, I'd really recommend that you do if you haven't. I know at uni, everyone's telling you read this, read that, but I'll say the book that Alex, I think, was trying to hassle you to read of mine, that's a bit more, it's easy reading in terms of flicking through, but this book's just really transformational in terms of the way that, you can conceive of time and humanity, the sort of, the way that we understand time. So I thought I'd put these quotes up here, which, I think maybe we find this confronting and rightly so in some ways, but I wanted to highlight the point that it all depends on your conception of time as to what you're interpreting. So Harari uses Aboriginal Australians in his book, with these terms here that we typically associate with British colonisation from 1788, but because he's looking, at a time scale relative to sapiens as a species, he sees it through a different lens. So I guess I'm just trying to get us to think about, the lens of time that we view, our design practice in. And so we'll keep sort of coming back to this or looking at this as a theme. And so here's a quote here from a forthcoming book by a professor who taught me and I worked with. And so this is probably a narrative that we're more, that we're more comfortable with, or that we hear more often, but again, it depends on our timescale or our conception of how we think through time, how immediate that is. And here's another quote. Sorry, I start off with quite a few quotes. I'm going to end up on more projects and the way designers have I guess explored some of these themes that I'm touching upon here today. But this is a book by Jeff Park, who's a Kiwi, and but there's a lot of parallels between New Zealand's history and Australia's history, and sure there's a lot of differences, but there's a lot of parallels. But he talks about ways of knowing with country, which I think the way he speaks to that and articulates that, it's not this lazy or intangible notion, but it comes through habitation over long periods. And I mean, he terms it as political ecology, and there'll be a similar term I use later. But this is a work from Dr. Scott Hayes here, who taught me when I was in third year. And this is the country that I'm on at the moment, Ghana. And this is a Ghana seasonal calendar. And you may or may not have seen these, but this is one of the first ones I'm aware of in Australia, going back to 1999. And so that concept of ways of knowing with country, I think is quite nicely articulated in this calendar. I'll just pick on one of the ones, the very top one, Walter, which means summer star appears, about the first or second week of December through to mid-January. So it's these indicators in the experience or when embedded in the landscape, that seasonal transition or markers of change and time and transition, temporality. And so, in the Western world, we're all sort of, caught up into varying degrees. It's a very linear process of time. And this is a reading that I was given in fifth year landscape architecture, and an interesting one in terms of the concept of time. The cyclical versus the linear. And again, this quote from the book I showed just before. There's a nice quote here talking about different, sort of two different ways we can experience time. One is this linear successional notion, which is, I think, in our day-to-day routines and, rushing, deadlines, completions, terms, semesters, assignments, jobs, schedules. But the second is this sort of phenomenological experience of time, which I think is spoken of quite nicely here in the way that past, present, and future sort of interwoven, and intertwined, and we don't experience those in a linear way. It's more of a phenomenological experience of them. And so, Atkins here is saying that these two are sort of integrated. And so I guess, some of these slides I'm showing, I'm getting us to think back, look back, sort of past, present, and future when we design. Because sometimes I think when we can design, we can be too fixated on the future, and this idea of what we're projecting, what we're going to realize in the end of the design process. But, I think the reflective part, that phenomenological experience of past is really important in what we do. And in relation to mine and Alex's discipline, I think landscape is good in being a medium that it's not something out there. I've got some other quotes later that I'll talk to what landscape is, but it's actually a process, an activity. It has a temporal characteristic and sort of iterative in the way that we deploy it. It's not just scenographic or fixed or an image, it has this living quality to it. And, we can speak of the things that I was speaking of, but, sure, we can use technology to harness these concepts and ideas as well. And so, you know, this is satellite imagery of the, well, you can see in Africa there, dust storms and fires, but also, yeah, the bushfires in Eastern Australia that we experienced, that again, I know Alex has talked about in the course outline or talk with you about. So we get a sense of the interconnectedness and the temporality of this, both in an immediate way or over a few months, or, you know, we can ponder the greater ramifications of these sorts of things. So that's a quick reflection on time. Now onto this concept of ownership, you know, because this sort of defines how we operate, again, in the built environment. And, you know, so ownership, this is I think a really fantastic spectrum of ethics here. And, you know, in the center is the individual purview, the egocentric, you know, the prominent messaging we receive through media, you know, and, you know, that sort of propels us to be consumptive, you know, and moving out from that, you know, we can have a sort of character. I mean, our culture, you know, the Western culture, Australian culture is largely sort of anthropocentric, which means human-centric, human-centered, you know, and some people might say, well, you know, what's the problem with that? Well, it relates back to the Anthropocene, that slide, that our cumulative effects as humans, or being human-centered, you know, has led to this significant, you know, crises really, whereby, you know, our planetary stability is undermined. So moving beyond the anthropocentric is the biocentric, where we have concern for other living beings, you know, and this is I guess a less human-centered, less selfish way to perceive the thing. But moving beyond that, you know, is ecocentric, and where we see, you know, the overall composition of living and non-living beings, you know, in a more Gaian, if anyone's read James Lovelock, or, you know, the Gaia hypothesis, or the sort of interdependence and interconnectivity of you know, inanimate and animate and inanimate objects, and the, again, that sort of planetary equilibrium that holds us all together. So ownership. So you've probably seen this before. This is a IATSIS map of Aboriginal Australia, and you can say that, you know, mapping like this is sort of, you know, not something that Koori cultures, you know, traditionally did. But what it shows is not only the great diversity in language groups, but I mean, it does show a sense of, I guess, contested territory or cooperative territory. I mean, at different times, different points, you know, things were fought. Other times they were cooperated, much like, you know, boundaries and territories in, you know, in our modern world today. But hopefully you've seen that before. If not, I mean, it's quite revelatory the first time you see it to perceive of the rich tapestry of culture and language that is so much more diverse than just this sort of reductive concept of Australian Aboriginal. But then let's move to, I guess, the system that we inherited in Australia, which was a British system. And so if we go back to the 13th century, there was a process of land enclosures. And, you know, this quote's talking about this, and it's sort of, you know, it's a power struggle between those with power or influence or wealth or military might, or how they're all intertwined. And, you know, what in England, at least, they term as the commoner populace, or, you know, sometimes, you know, termed to as peasants, which can be pejorative or not, depending on your perception. But, you know, it's this notion that, you know, of land ownership and power, and who exercises that, you know. So the top left image there is a plan of a medieval, spelt in the traditional way, manor, you know, and apologies if you can't see that, but, you know, it's like a tapestry of fields. There's common lands, there's common pastures. So, you know, what that meant was people could have animals and graze them on common lands, or they could go and source water or fuel for firewood, you know. But eventually, like I said, from the 13th century, land became more and more enclosed. So the second image is actually an image of Sydney. And in the top left, if you can see it or not, it says Ham Common. You know, so there were a series of commons across, you know, early Sydney, across maybe the first half century since Sydney's founding in 1788. And so eventually over time as well, these were, I guess, reappropriated, you know, and sort of whittled down, and to the point, I guess, where, you know, let's say the Western Sydney parklands in Sydney is, you know, it's certainly not common, but there is agriculture that takes place there. There's sort of conservation, there's recreation. So in a sense, you know, that's probably one of the closest resemblances to a commons. But let's just say I happen to be a bit strange and I have a herd of goats at home and I take them out to Western Sydney parklands. I'm probably, you know, going to be told to, you know, go home, take them home to my private or rented land, or I'll be arrested, or they'll be, you know, my goats will be enclosed and taken somewhere else. So, you know, it's a different concept of public space, and it doesn't have, you know, the same magnitude of sort of access. So, you know, it's something I wanted to alert you to. And as built environment designers and as spatial designers, you know, we're working within a very contested space of power and ownership and wealth and influence. And so even if, you know, you're working for a private client on a residential project, you're still working within that structure or that system. You know, when we work in the public domain, our projects become very politicized. You know, there's politicians, they might be in the paper, like exerting their influence. You know, the project might be in the paper, it'll relate to political cycles, it might be popular with one party. If the political party, if that party loses an election, the project might well be scrapped. So I think we're not necessarily educated. Well, I certainly wasn't. I can't speak for other places, but from what I've seen from accreditation reviews, at least in landscape architecture as a discipline, even though it's quite a public discipline, we're not really educated in how to navigate political processes and power processes and how that works. It's sort of something you learn on the job, or whether you're interested in it or not, whether you go down that path or not. And so does anyone know what this image is showing? Or I guess, you know, well, it's a satellite image taken at night. So any guesses on what the heck all that is? Alex, I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah. I'm guessing it could be, and maybe I feel like just because the kind of lighting up where I feel like predominantly mining exists could potentially be linked to power usage.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. They're mines, you know, and it's light pollution from both our urban, you know, you can see where all the capital cities are there, or the more major centres of settlement. But exactly like you said, Alex, the mines in Western Australia. I mean, look at the extent of mines there, and obviously, you know, the Hunter region closer to home for a lot of you as well. So, you know, this idea of a commons or a commonwealth, and, you know, ownership, who owns these resources, or, you know, where does the wealth generated from these resources go? You know, so an interesting contrast to Australia is Norway. Norway has a relatively large deposit of crude oil, and so the wealth they generate from that crude oil goes into a sovereign wealth fund, you know, which is, it's effectively a fund for the Norwegian people, you know, and so they have really high levels of education and healthcare. And I mean, our healthcare system in Australia is pretty damn good, you know, but it shows a different philosophy in divvying up this notion of what is a commonwealth, the Commonwealth of Australia. You know, I'm sort of posing to you, you know, is this wealth common, and do we actually have agency as citizens in debating or shaping where this goes? You know, again, it sort of comes back to power structures. And so this was an interesting article I came across a couple of years back, whereby you know, our democracy was downgraded a couple of years ago in 2019 in a global index. A monitor there you can see, and you see who we end up on par with: Botswana, Ghana, and the United States. You know, whereas previously in the map on the right, bottom right there, you can see we were previously open democracy. You know, and so this was downgraded through police raids on journalists and a few other factors like that effectively downgraded, you know, the notion of our civil liberties, you know, and the ability to voice those, to protest and the like. So there's been, even though there's the SBS, or it's the feed article, you know, there not much in the mainstream media about this kind of stuff. And I mean, this is fundamentally important to, you know, to what we do. Okay, so that's a quick fly through on ownership. Let's talk about the notion of growth. And so, you know, growth relates to development. And so maybe I'll start by talking about development. You know, we've got something like the United Nations, you know, development goals, you know, which are wonderful things, right? And I mean, I know a lot of universities sort of embrace those goals and try to integrate them into their curriculum or their, you know, their course outlines and projects. But, you know, the notion of, let's say development in a poor African country is very different from the notion of development, you know, in a wealthy country like Australia. And so this quote I've got here is sort of like this 20th century notion of a soar-away future of you know, development for the sake of, or growth for the sake of growth. You know, at what point, you know, is it beneficial, and what point does it become, you know, harmful in a sense? And so let's return to this Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime story of Tiddalik. So you might have to rack your brain here to remember this one, but this is Tiddalik the frog, whose unquenchable thirst drank up all the water in the landscape, you know, while the other animals, you know, suffered to their detriment, you know. And the end of the story is they had to work together to rack their brain to come up with a way to make Tiddalik laugh, to release the water back into the landscape, you know, for the benefit of everyone else. But so I don't know whether you've had much talk of neoliberalism in your, you know, in your education or wider than that. But, you know, in effect, it's our form of governance, or the structure of you know, global Western power, and governance structures. And, you know, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan really sort of brought it about, you know, sort of instilled it, or, you know, its onset from then. And then, you know, the Australian governments have done the same since then. But, you know, there's a Guardian journalist there, I quoted, George Monbiot, you know, which is, he terms it a self-serving racket, you know. And so this notion of, you know, this relates not just to growth, but to ownership and power and wealth and who it's distributed to. But the potato advocate there, I think, nailed it quite nicely with some of those, you know, some of those tongue-in-cheek headlines down the bottom there. You know, who's our government representing? Who are they going after? You know, and you know, whose interests are they serving? And so, you know, neoliberalism is essentially serving the interests of the super wealthy or the super powerful. But I want to contrast that, because not really that long ago, you know, this wasn't the case. And even though this is an example in Sydney, you know, Sydney has for a very long time been known as a sort of commercial centre of development, economic development, built development, you know, with not always a great amount of planning, or ethical planning, or, you know, whether that's social, environmental, or both. sort of standing in the way of that. But there was a movement in the 70s. You might have heard of this, of green bans, you know, and this was one of the large construction unions refusing to work on projects that they considered environmentally, socially, and aesthetically undesirable. And so, to me, I don't know what you all think, but you know, that was less than 50 years ago. It's 40 or 50 years ago. And to me now, that just seems unfathomable. You know, I just can't imagine that happening in contemporary Sydney. But, you know, and the sort of timescales we've been looking at today, not really that long ago. And again, quite relevant to, you know, to our disciplines here. So, yeah, our current political system is neoliberal, but it wasn't always that way, and it doesn't have to be that way moving forth. And it's up to, you know, people power to change that. But, you know, is there a sort of, you know, comfortable numbness? You know, I mean, we live across the board pretty well in Australia. I know the gap between the wealthy and the have-nots is increasing. It's nowhere near as bad as in countries like the USA or the United Kingdom. But, you know, how much do we care at the end of the day? Or, you know, how sort of comfortable are our lives, you know, to actually push back against these power structures that, as Peter Newell here says, you know, the people holding the cards, you know, they're not going to give up their position easily, you know. And so if we roll over to this, then we're just going to be stuck with it, sort of thing. So but then, you know, as protest or activism laws become harsher and harsher, or you know, journalists are raided, or you get a permanent criminal record for protesting an issue, you know, that makes people think twice about speaking out about certain things. And, you know, we need to be aware of these things and, you know, conscious of them, because they're super important. So yeah, the term here, political economy, we talked about political ecology earlier, but, you know, it's this notion that what we do is politicized. And again, I'll bring it back to what we do as built environment practitioners. You know, what we do is very politicized. And here's just a graphic of Sydney from 1788 that I've done. The bottom figure ground is the spatial footprint, and the graph, this notion of this soar-away future, you know, or continual growth, you know. And so, I mean, most of the capital cities in Australia, obviously Melbourne and Sydney, have had the most growth and the most sort of steady, continual growth. You know, Newcastle, I know, has a different trajectory. I lived in Geelong for a while, which is similar to Newcastle, and similar stories there. But I mean, still this sort of paradigm of continual growth, which is largely fed through the federal government's sort of mandate of population growth. You know, it's sort of what we consider to be normal. But you know, for any international students here, or, you know, those of you that have traveled, you know, you'd know that that's not necessarily the case in a lot of places. This book's quite old now, but I think it's, you know, it's just a counter notion to the fact that growth is this continual linear process, and that's necessarily a good thing, you know. So, you know, but what we've seen in the United States is young people moving to places like Detroit and Cleveland because it's a hell of a lot more affordable than California or New York State. And you know, there's space there. There's cheap housing. You know, there's land. They can grow food. You know, they can pursue creative pursuits without spending, you know, 40% of their salary on public transport, or, you know, or whatever it is. So yeah, I guess you know, and I mean, Newcastle and Geelong have a bit of that about them, you know, which I think makes them super interesting. You know, just this contested linear growth that we see with Sydney, you know, is, you know, yeah, it lends us opportunities on one hand, but it's also you know, challenging on another. So let's shift to, you know, the part that's hopefully, you know, going to be a bit more interesting for us all here. You know, talking about how have designers approached some of these topics I've been talking about. And so look, some of these might seem a little bit peripheral, and I said to Alex, you know, I don't want to talk to stuff that's completely out of timing, I think, or irrelevant from what, you know, you're all doing or where you're at. But Alex encouraged me to sort of stick with it, and that it would be of interest, or hopefully a wider interest to what you're doing. But, you know, so I like to think of you know, design as a thinking, as a tool to think, you know, and you would have heard all the cliches about, you know, creative problem solving. You know, we might use scenarios, projective design, imaginaries to see different futures. But, you know, these tools come naturally to us as spatial designers in the built environment through the way we think, which, going back to the time theme I showed before, isn't necessarily linear. We, you know, a lot of the times we work in a circular or iterative way, and so that's not necessarily the norm. And I think for those of you that have practiced, or, you know, moving into practice, already working in practice, when you work with other disciplines, you know, you see that that's not often the case. So, you know, this was one of the questions that someone kindly submitted, and I thought I'd answer it. And it's a classic, sort of those classic questions. It's like the tabula rasa, you know, like, and that's often they're often the hardest sites to design, or the hardest briefs to respond to. You know, in some cases, when we have constraints, it's often easier to come up with solutions. So it's a tricky question, but I thought I would answer it through showing this this work by Dr. Paul Downton, going back to 1996. And so Paul was a mentor of mine when I was a student, and I've done some work with him since, which is always nice to do. And so what we see here on the far left is Adelaide in the year it was founded. So the equivalent of 1788 for Sydney, 1835 for Melbourne, or wherever. So, and I mean, I don't want to get too caught up in this, but it's important to, I think, note that 1836 depiction there, that was a cultural landscape. That was a Ghana landscape where the Ghana people had reshaped that over millennia. You know, and it's not necessarily this notion of a series of ecologies. And I think slowly we're starting to understand that more. But in essence, what Paul's shown there is, you know, a landscape that was managed but had a lot of ecological integrity and function. And, you know, the custodians, you know, they changed that over long periods of time, but they still managed it in quite a sustainable way. So move to the year that they did this exercise. And so shadow planning is a planning exercise that, you know, anyone can do in any city. And it's based on a concept by Richard Register from EcoCity Builders in California. And so Paul Downton used that methodology here in Adelaide. And so what they've effectively done in the year they did in 1996, they've mapped it. And, you know, the red you can see is sort of the built environment to the north, which is actually the east. The north isn't up page. The unsustainable agriculture you can see there in the Adelaide Hills. You know, there were mangroves and aquatic environments that have been transformed into industry, industrial lands. And then, so the next process they did was to look ahead to 2076, you know, and so effectively, I mean, this is long-term planning, right? I mean, it comes back to that notion of time, like where are we headed? You know, there's a great book by James Kunstler called The Long Emergency, and it talks about basically about how crude oil is just the most incredible energy source we have at our fingertips as humans, but it's finite and it is going to run out one day. And how do we plan for that long emergency, along with, you know, climate change and other things that are brought about through fossil fuel usage? And so that has a really nice temporal nature to that writing, in terms of what we're doing, you know, in a more immediate sense, has a much longer arc as well. And so that's why I really love these shadow plans. And so you can effectively see 2076, they were trying to increase the density of the built environment, rehabilitate the creeks and waterways, restore the native forest on the hill slopes to, to reduce erosion and whatnot. And then looking further ahead to 2136, same sort of process. So urban consolidation, getting rid of sprawl, having, sustainable, which I think at the time was, like sort of high-speed rail connections between sort of satellite cities of medium to high density. So again, I haven't really seen too many plans that have looked over this sort of timescale or tried to understand, on a day-to-day level how slow change is, but on this, sort of, multiple century timescale, where we're heading. So I do really encourage you to think at those longer timescales about where we're heading. Have many of your lecturers shoved this one down your throat over the years? Anyone want to jump in the chat and tell me the firm who produced this?
Iman, I think it's one of your favorites. You like to talk about their work a lot.
Is it Super Studio?
Close. MDRDV.
MDRDV. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah. Thanks for guests. It's always always well, there's so much great work out there, isn't there? But so I mean, this is the sort of almost the opposite of what I just showed, in a sense of, the Dutch have a completely different conception of landscape or habitation, whereby, half of their landmass is reclaimed land from the sea, sort of that low-lying delta environment. Half of their landmass is at or below sea level. So sea level rise to them isn't just about climate change. It's just a reality that they've dealt with for their overall existence. They're the second largest producer of agriculture by value in the world. So Metacity Datatown, 1999, I think, book, where it's just, again, at the time, just cutting edge, it just spatialized these spatial projections of this hypothetical city. And so the point I wanted to make with this is, I think, again, as built environment or spatial people, we can take for granted these skills that we have. But going back to sort of say the neoliberal or the chimes we hear from elitists saying we're going to grow by this many million in the next decade, and they don't necessarily appreciate what that means. And as spatial people, we can translate that. And this is what Alex has said. He's given you some readings by Richard Weller. So these are two books. The second one's by Weller and another brilliant guy called Julian Bolleter. And so what they did is, the left one is about Perth, and it's about Perth's projected population growth and spatializing that across a series of scenarios. And Weller presents all these different spatial footprints for, you can see some of them there in that top image. He sort of isolates each of the scenarios. One of them's food city, for example, and then in this image here, sort of combining them together or doing combinations of them. And then the second book on the right is a similar thing, whereby, sorry, just trying to close this pop-up without a mouse. It's a similar thing at a national scale, where it doesn't just look at the major cities as well. It looks at the regional cities, their growth, their projections, possible spatial patterns, looks at high-speed rail. So, I mean, these to me are just seminal works in planning and spatializing architecture and landscape of Australian cities and futures. So if you haven't looked at those, check them out, because they're just, they're fantastic works. This is a colleague of mine, Dr. Simon Kilbane, and so sort of championing the non-human. This is quite an ecocentric, certainly a biocentric approach, and this is what his PhD explored. It was a national scale green infrastructure grid or system for Australia, where he based it sort of in Western Australia and across this transect, that purple line you can see there, you know, from quite a metropolitan condition, you know, through to the peri-urban, through into the rural and remote. And he looked at, you know, this notion of ecological connectivity and how a green infrastructure network could potentially be executed at this huge national scale, or, you know, even a state scale here. And so, yeah, that won a bunch of awards a couple of years back. But again, so this is, you know, this is often the realm of ecologists, right? But you can't say ecologists don't understand space, you know, which, you know, that's not necessarily true. But in a sense, again, coming back to us as built environment people, we can spatialize things in a way that a lot of other disciplines can't. So even though this is applying an ecological concept, it's using our spatial ability to do that. So Richard Weller was actually Simon's supervisor, and so he sort of ran with this idea. And Alex might have shown you this, but this is his notion of a world park. So it's looking at the key biodiversity hotspots and how they can be connected. On the left image of North and South America there, a north-south corridor, ecological corridor, and an east-west corridor sort of running from the Mediterranean through into Indonesia, there you can see. So again, super intelligent spatial sort of multi-dimensional thinking coming together to effectively implement or start to apply this notion of biologist Edward Wilson's notion that we should be locking half the earth away for other species, you know. And so to me, this is the sort of targeted approach of that. You know, these are the hotspots, the places where the most biodiversity, you know, is occurring or still exists. And so how do we link those and knit those together? So going back to the Netherlands, this is a multidisciplinary firm that looked at flooding in the Netherlands, and, you know, sort of like a climate change adaptation project before that they were even a thing. But again, because the Netherlands deal with these issues of, you know, being at or below sea level. And so, yeah, it's just a really fantastic project in terms of, instead of building more hard infrastructures, which effectively, you know, become less and less economically viable, certainly as neoliberal governance doesn't want to pay for infrastructure, you know, it's in the private sector nowadays. And if the private sector is not making money off it, well then, you know, then it's not necessarily going to happen. It's like nuclear power, it's too expensive to build. That's why we have renewable energy, because it's the cheapest form of building our energy and supplementing our energy grid. And so, you know, this is a real opportunity for, you know, for a landscape approach, and allowing those floodplains to flood and not building in those areas. You know, I guess in Australia we have the issue more with our coastal, you know, our sort of the heavier surf context, or, you know, and the way sea level rise or storms can affect those. So they brought that group of Dutch architects and landscape architects over to New Orleans. I think it was after Hurricane Katrina, or, you know, going back a bit now. And, you know, basically New Orleans, a huge part of the city is again sort of built where it should never have been built. You know, so it's that notion, as in it's so low lying, it's the end of a floodplain, and there's a levee, you know, protecting it from the sea. And so, yeah, during that hurricane, that's why it was, if you recall, so terribly flooded, and, you know, they had to evacuate a huge proportion of the city, and all these horrible things happen. So it's really tricky in the built environment sometimes, whereby we've got something here that probably never should have been built in that environment. And to what extent can design thinking, you know, help that city to stay there? Or at what point do you draw a line in the sand and say, hey, we need to do planned retreat? But again, there's so much power and wealth and money invested in this that, you know, it's always going to be a super contested space and a really complex design challenge to work within. And so a couple of professors from Harvard went to the Netherlands and ran a studio over there. And this is one of the student projects. Kimberly Garza and Sarah Thomas, they looked at de-damming the Dutch Delta. So it's totally moving away from that notion of building levees and banks and infrastructures to control water, and looking at how those systems can be decommissioned in effect, and more designed, naturalized systems that work at a systemic scale, be conceived and executed, to allow those systems to flood, and the ebbs and flows of them over time to still accommodate, as well, increased biodiversity in the process, as you see, and economies. So again, this is sort of really intelligent design thinking, problem solving, approaching what was a 20th century legacy of hard infrastructures, grey infrastructures, into what we'd call green and blue infrastructures of the 21st century. Alex has told me that you've either looked at Fresh Skills Park or he's told you to look at it. But I mean, this is a fantastic project, and I've only got a couple of the graphics there, but if you haven't looked at it, I really encourage you to go in there and look at that report. You can download it online. I think there's a 2005 or 2006 master plan online. It's about 100 pages, A3. It's just got fantastic graphics in it. They still hold up today, even though it's 15 or 20 years old, because it was one of the first projects to really move away from this notion of a fixed master plan to something that involves the need to manage and orchestrate different stages over time concurrently and adapt as things go. And again, in design, it's really hard to convince a client, to sort of commit to that process. And with political cycles and timeframes being quite short, when we're dealing with decades, in relation to this project, it's quite hard to get those things across the line. But this was a really fantastic project that did that. So check that one out. This is a project that looked at climate change adaptation in Houston, which was drying climate, whereby this arboretum previously had a high percentage of forest cover, but there just wasn't enough moisture in that landscape to sustain the amount of tree canopy. So this master plan looked at adapting to a different climate and managing those sort of constructed ecologies, in a sense, or those vegetation communities that were in there, and how sort of symbiosis of all that can be managed moving ahead into a climate that was quite different from when the original arboretum was designed. And one thing I learned in pretty early in design practice was, don't be shy with your drawings. When you study, there's always these incredible people who can just draw so amazingly. And I had a director who, they definitely weren't a better drawer than I was, but I was always a bit shy with the drawings, and he just wasn't shy with it, right? And so we'd go to client meetings and he'd just pull out butter paper and he'd start drawing, and everyone would just gather around. If otherwise it's a talk fest, but when he'd draw, it was just such an icebreaker, and it spatialized things and it articulated ideas, and people say, no, that isn't what I meant, and then you do another version. And so I guess the message here is, don't be shy with your drawing. Really use it as a tool in practice, because again, it's one of these really important skills that we have. And so this one here, this example I'm showing you is about sea level rise inundating this valley in this town. And you can see the community on the bottom left that you're engaging with. So they've taken a sort of just a soft hand-drawn approach to, communicate, like flooding and inundation and sea level rise, which you imagine a computer graphic of that would be a lot more confronting, as a way to start a conversation on these sorts of topics, which are really wicked challenges. So think about the way you use drawing and design, and the medium and the execution of that as appropriate to a given context or community, or project? What's the right way to approach, that graphic communication as a tool? So these are two quotes I use all the time, and I sort of use it as a critique of the discipline I find myself in now, that, landscape is often just a surface treatment, and it relates to this notion of greenwash. So what I've shown you are, I think, are projects that are have got much more depth in them than this surface treatment. And James Corner, who held the position that Richard Weller now holds and is a huge hero in landscape architecture, I think articulates it really well here. And if, for me at least, these are the two of the most strongest characteristics of my discipline, if I were to be super critical of it. It's a sort of middle class aesthetic, or it's a naturalized veil. It's this I call it like a garden of nature. It's said that it's got this really ecological meaningfulness to it, but often it doesn't. Often it's just us gardening, which has, I'm not saying, I'm a gardener myself, right? So I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense, but it's sort of being accurate to what you're doing, is something that we're not always great at in the built environment. So yeah, love those quotes. And so what I'll show here is these sort of post-industrial projects. And again, knowing that, I know you're doing a shopping mall at Westfield, but more widely in Newcastle, as a centre of a prior centre of industry, or I mentioned Geelong and other locations across Australia, across the world. This gasworks park here by Richard Haag in the early 70s. This was one of the first projects in the world that said, no, we don't want to knock down the gasworks. We want to retain that. And I've worked on, many projects in practice where we have that fight, where people just think, oh, it's ugly, it's toxic, it's dirty, it caused cancer or suffering, erase it, but, that's not honest, and it's not authentic. It's denying a layer of history and all the stories and narratives and livelihoods and meanings, and also the lessons learnt from that. And so this was one of the first projects that said no to that. They fenced off the gasworks. You can see there, it's not actually accessible, but it really flipped the script on conceiving, post-industrial sites as something that should be, expressed with authenticity, and that layer revealed. And this is another one in Germany, and really famous one, and just an amazing place. And the top left image is part of a much larger valley I think it's the Ruhr Valley in Germany, or the Emscher Valley. It's huge. And so this is like the gem, in this massive landscape network of industry, and sort of the fallout of, Germany's incredible industrious economy in the 20th century. And so when this project first came about, everyone said, no one wants to go there. They wanted it demolished, but then after a certain amount of time, and Peter Latz, just masterfully sort of orchestrating this project, there's actually a youth hostel there, and, you can go there and you can go snorkeling in one of the old vats. People actually go to this once, toxic industrial landscape to experience this sort of incredibly powerful spaces that are there, and those past narratives. So yeah, that's perhaps normal to us now. It wasn't, but again, there's a lot of projects where you've got to sort of fight to do that. This is another one, much smaller one in the USA, really low budget project, and it's in Pennsylvania, sort of depressed economically area with a lot of unemployment and whatnot. And so it was about engaging with the community and using natural processes in these ponds you can see in the bottom right image to sequentially filter this toxic water through phytoremediation of plants, and engaging the community in that process. And so that's a low budget example. This is a super high budget example, but of a similar pre-existing character. So this is a London Olympics site. It was incredibly toxic, much like the Sydney Olympics site. But, a project at this scale involves so many actors and stakeholders and vested interests and organisations, You know, the previous one I showed was, you know, go to the local town hall, sit down with the community, have a conversation with them. This one is just such a global, huge event that, you know, it had a completely transformative effect, you know, on the landscape. And, you know, it's a beautiful place to visit. And when you see the before and the after, you know, it's amazing. A whole lot of, you know, like a flashpoint of design, creativity, and genius, and these really innovative planting mixes up in the top right that happen and whatnot. But there was a layer of community there that inevitably got sort of wiped out in the process. There was a allotment, which is like a community garden, you know, right in the middle of it, that got sort of wiped out. But that's sort of project of that scale, you know, how do you avoid that? It's tricky, you know, there's always a bit of fallout. And this is a former brickworks in Toronto that's become a real hub of the community in terms of, you know, the events and the social programming of the site. So in addition to its transformation, you can see there from the top left to the top right, where it was this big brick pit, it's now, you know, a series of wetlands and retained structures that, you know, that hosts the likes of ice skating, you can see in the bottom left, and I think pretty regular fortnightly farmers markets type things, community organizations and whatnot, and I believe is still successful in an ongoing way. And again, you know, this is sort of project where you have to fight to retain, you know, these buildings and structures, and you know, you sort of got to be there up front in the process of the project before these decisions are made to influence them. And so it's often the voice of us as architects, landscape architects, urban designers who have to champion these things, because otherwise these layers of history get wiped out and these opportunities for adaptive reuse, you know, are missed, and we get, you know, often generic or placeless spaces as a result. This is just jumping in scale to an edible garden in a public space in Detroit. That was actually a private space bought by an IT firm for the well-being of this guy's employees. You know, he's smart enough to realize that if his employees went out, communed with nature, got their hands dirty, or had, you know, something that they could pour positive energy into, it actually made them happier, more productive employees. So this firm built this space. It was sort of privatized. You can see some fences on there, but it was really successful, and the wider community loved it. And so they donated it. This guy or his firm donated it back to the community. It's now a public park. And so, and I think it's sort of shifted a little bit from food species, which do have their challenges in public spaces. You know, it incorporates pollination species and is looking at that story, but I could talk about that all day. I'll keep moving. This is the Madrid Rio project, where the top image was indicative of Madrid's sort of inner urban core, these roads that just completely dominated the public domain. You imagine trying to cross that, like how the heck you cross? It's just not an environment for humans. And so I think the mayor at the time wanted to underground 41 kilometers of road within his political cycle, which pretty much bankrupted the city. But what was achieved out of it was a lot of public domain projects. And so in some ways you can say that you know, undergrounding doesn't solve the traffic problem, but to their credit, there were a whole lot of other initiatives that they pursued to try and reduce that private vehicular dependence and improve public transport, cycling, and facilitate that through the, you know, the at grade or on ground spatial access through these parks. And this one is an edible park that sort of riffs on a previous palace that was on the site and the palace garden that was there before. And this one hopefully be of interest. This is a rooftop in Chicago of a sort of community building. And so, I mean, what I wanted to talk about with this one just briefly is understanding the community that you're operating within. I mean, I went to Chicago in the 90s to go look at Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, and it was one of the scariest train rides I've ever had in my life. You know, it was a real eye-opener. And, you know, so this project was about getting youth off the streets to do various sporting activities. But this rooftop garden space I'm showing is an edible garden on the rooftop above the basketball court. And there's a chef employed and a gardener, or a couple of gardeners employed, who work together. And you can see in the top right, you know, sort of educating kids about both how to grow food, how to eat healthily, how to cook food. So, I mean, this is a sort of more similar to your typology, you know, that Alex has got you looking at of the Westfield or the mall, you know, in the sense of it's sort of semi-public space in some ways. You know, someone owns it, but they allow the public to access it through controlled, you know, timings that it's open, you know, or whatever you have to do registration-wise and all that to access it. So I think this one might be, you know, bringing it down in scale, which was my intention today. Start big and end up, you know, bringing it down to hopefully some useful things we can discuss in relation to your project. So yeah, I am getting near the end of the talk, mercifully. And yeah, this is another one, again, just about knowing your context. This is in London, and you know what they have in London are called these meanwhile spaces. And so I've worked on projects similar whereby, you know, development might be slated for a site, it might be a couple of years away. And so can we create a sense of community or activation or engagement? So this was an urban orchard, and it was part of the London Architecture Festival in 2010. A whole series of events and cinema and workshops and whatnot happened. And, you know, people learnt, you know, how to make cider and, you know, grow fruit trees and all that sort of thing. And you can see it was designed for disassembly. And at the end of the festival, well, it was quite successful. It kept going for a bit, but then at the end, you know, when development came in or whatever, they then handed on the plants and the fruit trees to the local community. And so they designed, you know, with that intention in mind. So I know that's a recurring theme in a lot of projects. I think there's the last project, you know, this is about a volunteer program in Vancouver. You know, it's a pretty progressive city, and it's about verge gardening, you know, which, you know, you might have heard of. You know, we tend to often tend to grow edible plants in the nature strips, you know, we normally call them in Australia, or the verge. And so this was a project that saw that the community in Vancouver, or various communities in Vancouver, were doing this, and the municipality looked at how they could facilitate that, create a sort of organizational framework where the concerns of traffic engineers, such as sight lines and safety, you know, and whatnot. So they produced a series of guidelines in how to manage it, and then, you know, people would sign up for a plot, effectively, of the public domain to take care of it. You know, you can see the top right image. You know, the woman there is you know, flower gardening is sort of a thing, but you know, a lot of them are edible. And so, you know, that's a sort of, you know, nice story in terms of harnessing, you know, the impetus of a community. Whereas I think in the Sunshine Coast up there, the council went through with bulldozers and just flattened a whole series of verge gardens without telling the residents that they were going to, you know, in part of an ongoing debate. And so, you know, that's always really heartbreaking when, you know, a local government takes that approach and didn't even give the residents the opportunity to transplant the trees or take them out, sort of thing. So again, I'm sort of getting back to the way we manage, you know, our projects and our processes, and the sort of social and interpersonal relationships that can be nurtured, you know, through design. It's not just this spatial thing, but it's a whole web of processes. So yeah, let's end up on a quote I love here by Murray Bookchin, you know, and I think it's what keeps a lot of us ticking as spatial designers is this notion of, well, you know, we can see a better world, and you know, and we want to bring that about. And so the future isn't predetermined, you know, it's up to us collectively of what we make it. So I know that might be a bit of airy-fairy, but it sort of keeps me going, at the same time keeps me inspired. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I probably talked too long. Apologies, Alex. So
no, that's fine. You did such a great job. I feel like I've probably got enough questions to last 2 hours. So, we can, you know, always chat. I want to open it up to the students to jump in, guys. Feel free to, well, maybe I will actually open up the debate and get people kind of talking. So what I loved is you sort of ended on your second last slide was community lock gardens. And then your last slide was the globe. It's sort of this, and I think that's so interesting in a lot of the students' projects, specifically in my studio, where they're kind of grappling with this, with this sort of scale, and and how to somewhat elevate their project, and you looked at things like the green grid, which are quite, at points maybe could be criticized as being a bit esoteric or a bit hard to implement, and certainly Simon's research is at this sort of macro scale. I wonder how, if there's any kind of advice or any kind of words on how to sort of design with those two in mind, the kind of the macro and the micro, because some of the students are grappling with that at the moment.
Yeah, and there was a question as well about that, and so I probably didn't spend as much time as I liked in the talking about the micro, which is super important, because I like to talk about the macro, or I just love the macro, right? So I get a bit lost in it, but the micro is super important and super meaningful, and working on small projects. I worked on a garden for ex-offenders, in a halfway house, and often that's got more meaning or significance, or in some ways impact, than a $1 billion public domain project that just drives you mad and goes in circles and doesn't end up going anywhere. So it's that classic thing, think global and act local, isn't it? And how much how much influence do we each have? And so I don't think it matters what scale you operate on, but if you can bring that bigger picture systemic thinking in to whatever scale, and question about the rainwater tank in the questions as well, that it's funny, because that irked the hell out of me 20 years ago. I had exactly the same the same sort of questions, and they're not easy answers. How do you convince people at the coalface or at that micro scale to do and commit to these things, and so I'll jump sort of onto that question. And there's a great book called How to Win Friends and Influence People, I think it's called, written in 1930. And so it's sort of, I think, understanding your audience and trying to reach them at the level they're at, and understand their motivations. And so money is a motivation, the primary motivation in architecture and built environment projects for so many people. So that's why we see so many solar panels on roofs, because it makes financial sense to people. So then how do we move beyond that to a rainwater tank that while water costs are low, doesn't make financial sense to people? I remember I worked with colleagues from Germany, and they just couldn't believe how cheap water was in Australia, where it's our most precious resource, arguably. And so, until that, dynamic shifts, then you've got to rely on other arguments to convince people. It might be self-sufficiency, it might be water quality, depending. Sydney's got pretty good mains water, but Adelaide, for example, mains water is terrible. So you'll see a lot more rainwater tanks in Adelaide, or the notion of drought here is more prevalent than on the East Coast. And so or there's more of a tradition of that, or it comes from a tradition of gardens and whatnot. But I think it's getting back to sort of understanding your client, or your stakeholders, and like genuinely, really trying to understand what makes them tick, and then, trying to reach them on a level that works for them. Is it for a greater good? Is it money? Is it somewhere in the middle? Is it their family? Is it their children? Is it their grandchildren? You know, you've got to sort of try and hit those points, you know.
Yeah, and I think you're to the point of, you know, convincing people in meetings. I can't re-emphasize enough, drawing in meetings is just such a powerful tool. And I think it's such a good point that it almost reinforces this idea of evolutionary design or iterative design. And I think that's very much what the students are sort of focused in on this assignment number 2 is that there isn't a silver bullet, and there's, you know, there's multiple answers, and maybe it's more about, like you say, that kind of fresh kills of how to orchestrate or sort of, you know, really kind of hit those acupuncture points at a time, like a choreography over 50 years or 100 years or, you know, 2000 years, however long it takes to kind of fulfill that project. And I specifically remember I was hitting a wall when I was designing the herbarium down at the Australian National Botanic Gardens, and I looked up the client and realized that he actually was an architect as well and worked in private practice, and realized that he probably had a vision himself. And it was only until I got the pen and paper out and actually went down there and sat and designed with him did we actually start spending the project fee, and, you know, came up with a design we all agreed on. So
and that's how you build, like you're saying, Alex, I mean, that's how you build relationships with people. That's what being inclusive is. And I've worked on a project where, you know, it was a huge public project and the design was done, and you present it to the community, and I had to stand there on a weekend, and the community came through, and the two themes of feedback from everyone was, oh, the buildings are too tall, and why weren't we involved in the design process? You know, like their agency had been taken away from them. So sitting down with a drawing or coming in with a sketch, you know, like Alex, if your experience is similar, it's just a hand-drawn sketch, something soft at the start, just is so much more gentle than a computer render. Even if the computer renders a draft, you know, we see that very differently to what non-designers do. So yeah, even if you work in the computer and then you do a sketch over it, it's a much softer way to engage a community or a client and feel like they have agency in the design process, which is normally a good thing, you know, again, especially in public projects. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, those actors, I think, you know, they will be your biggest villains, but if you get them on side, they'll be your biggest champions and supporters. So I think, you know, I just think that was a really great point. I wonder, do we have any other questions? Because I will just.
Yeah, I've got a question for Josh. First off, thank you, Josh, for such an amazing speech and interesting the examples that you've shown about post-industrial architecture and whatnot. I have a quick question regarding about one of the chapters that you wrote in your book about decentralizing infrastructures. Yeah, this is the sort of avenue I'm looking at in terms of the next phase of my design assignment for Alex's project. And what I'm like sort of thinking architecture of the next 50 years is more probably won't be just retail spaces. It could be like decentralized, and in order to, like, you know, create a bit of a social connectedness while retail programs are being happened. So what I'm looking at is, like, what if we take out all these retail spaces maybe and like plonked in within the urban, like a residential fabric, so that when I, for example, go to a supermarket or something and I see my friends are shopping, and it just sort of creates a sense of connectedness and whatnot. So I'm trying to think about this like social resilience while designing more. So what I'm like finding slightly, what I'm struggling at the moment slightly is if that's the case, if I'm to like decentralize malls and plonk it onto, say, urban fabric or residential fabric, what are the potential programs I could put it back into the malls, for example? Like, what are the trade-offs do I have? So do you have any suggestion or like, any piece of advice regarding that matter?
Yeah, great question. And I love your background.
Awesome. Thank you.
Very biophilic nature, Rich, much nicer than mine. But yeah, look, it's a great question. And
I'm in the studio, so.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
I'm at uni studio, so there's like way too many people around me. So.
Yeah. Let's start on decentralization, because I remember, like, as a student in the 90s, it was sort of coming out of, it's still a fair way off, but there was a Cold War era. We call them preppers now, whereby solar, which was super expensive and not very powerful, preppers would have a solar panel system and a rainwater tank, and they'd be off the grid, and they'd be, to reduce their dependencies on that. Whereas now I think we have a better understanding of the sort of interconnected nature of the world we live in, and the sort of codependencies, and where you can have a grid connected system, but and be independent. It's the best of both worlds in a sense. So I think we need both centralized and decentralized systems as a general principle. And I think, going to your point of distributing retail, I can sort of imagine, firstly, I think like an analysis of where existing things are, where existing social infrastructures are. So the notion of a food desert, right? And we know of this more, say, in Western Sydney, where you're a longer drive away from, or in a lower density environment where you're longer drive away from somewhere where you can buy fresh food. And then the nature of the built fabric is lower density, so it supports less infrastructures, less social infrastructures, and that's sort of one of the key critiques of low density environments. So, but I guess what I'm getting at is, you want to sort of study where existing things are and at what concentration rates can potentially be supported. So it makes me think of going back 15 years or whatever, when Sydney branded itself the city of villages. And that is a fantastic thing about Sydney, whereby you do have these high streets or connections of villages, and people stay within those areas. And I lived in Manly for a while, and it was like that. You didn't have to go anywhere else. You had everything you needed at your fingertips. You didn't need a car. You get the ferry, get the bus or whatever, and all sorts of recreation around it. So as that notion of the village as a social infrastructure, which is in some ways the antithesis of a mall, which is getting to the heart of your question, is, what can we repurpose the mall at? And so I think, you're suggestive of the fact that over time, and like Alex is saying, infrastructure, do you do it in the levels of do you decommission, the highest level first down? Do we reintegrate the ground floor with a sense of the public domain? Do you redesign that? Because, it's the ground floor. We know that malls are inward facing, but, and that's one of their key critiques as well. But that activation on the ground floor is really important. And so what could take over tenancies potentially, and then in what sort of timeframes in terms of, like saying, acupuncture, at what point? And, does it become a large urban farm or something at some point, or aquaponics, as a level of it become, fish production? And like you said, the retail actually gets distributed, in different forms within more smaller interconnected communities in the wider area or whatnot. But yeah, look, it's a really tricky question, and I think bring it back to time and see it being a sort of staged process. And I think that's what Alex would like you to do. I mean, sure, some things might happen quickly, but they'll be sequenced probably over time, and it will happen incrementally. There might be key points, but yeah, I'd encourage you to think about and vision, what it could be at different points, which is hard, super hard to do, and there's no right or wrong or easy answers with it, in a sense,
I think we sort of started looking at this kind of sequential resolution of our design. So we sort of put up like a 10 years, 20 years, and a 50-year time frame. So yeah, thanks for these answers. I feel like there could be like multiple sort of resolutions over time. There's no like, you know, dead end or not one solution to this.
Yeah,
Proposal, in a way.
Like 5 or 10 years, you might be a little bit more conservative in terms of what it could be, you know, compared with in 30 years or 50 years, you could be completely radical, you know, like you can completely re-envision what that might be. So, you know, or I mean, depends how open Alex and your jurors are to being radical and how quickly. But I think, you know, going back to that book I mentioned of the long emergency, you know, you make incremental changes over the short term to bring about, you know, more significant changes over longer periods of time. I mean, that's that avoids sort of shocks or crises and allows transitions to take place. And I think that's why something like Fresh Skills is really fantastic as a project, because it sort of graphically shows you how that process can happen.
Upset. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
I'm keen to see what you come up with.
Oh yeah, awesome.
All right. It's a really great question, Iman, and I think it sort of plugs into or highlights how we sort of have to be designer on one, you know, in one role. We've sort of got to be designer, but then we've also got to be this sort of futurist or almost, you know, and some of the students are looking at, you know, economics and projected trends in you know, say online retail and Amazon, and is that the sort of the death of at least 70% of them all is retail shops. So what does it evolve to before it gets to that? So these patterns and these trends or these systems are so important, both looking at the past, but where are they pointing us? And Eamon specifically is kind of looking at sort of almost chucking some of these facilities out into the surrounding urban fabric. But you know, he rightly says what goes back into these spaces, and you know, and I think Broadacre, although it's quite rough, but certainly Frank Lowe Wright's Broadacre City was a really exemplary kind of rough draft at looking at how a kind of, you know, you talk of these villages. Villages could be systematically kind of programmed in terms of food production and solar production. Granted, I don't think Frank really looked at the social cohesion aspect.
The old master and apprentice, but I agree in terms. I think what you see there, and I mean, I think he was influenced by Ebenezer Howard's, you know, garden cities.
Right.
Is the notion of the space required, for example, for agricultural production, and so that's where, you know, cities. That's why Sydney's so frustrating to me, because all the agricultural land is just being evaporated. It's in a finite topographic basin, but other cities that haven't put that much pressure on their land uses, it's a real opportunity to you know, reimagine or re-envision a more diverse, you know, network. And so yeah, Sydney's a tricky one like that. And you know, in another sense, I haven't really touched on it, but like re-envisioning retail in the mall is a wicked problem in a sense. It's super tricky one to solve, you know. And so I said, like, an aquaponics production place, but you know, could easily be Amazon's drone distribution center, you know, for retail where everyone's shopping online. So how do you then, you know, does like I said, the ground floor become, you know, a social hub, or do the social hubs get broken up and distributed to walking distances to, you know, the key sort of, you know, smaller centers, you know, surrounding there, you know? Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, but exciting, I guess, at the same time.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if there is any student who wants to make a question. I saw in the chat one of my students asking, Amira, eventually you want to formulate the question.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so in the chat, my project's based on sea rising level and mudflats and the whole ecosystem of bird migration. So yeah, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on, you know, sea rising level and decreased tidal flats and mudflats and potentially losing the ecosystem in relation to that? Yeah.
Yeah, there was have you seen I think there was or maybe it didn't happen, or maybe it did. I was sort of involved with a colleague that he was trying to get like an international bird competition going up, or it might have even happened a couple of years ago. Apologies if it hasn't, but it was looking at these corridors and sort of key touch points globally, you know, which I know Geelong was one of them. There's a bunch of Ramsar wetlands around there, and I know Alex has probably mentioned to you, McGregor Coxall did a sort of bird airport type concept in China.
Yeah, I saw that,
yeah. So it's sort of, you know, it's like weaving the that sort of global scale through, which sort of touched on a bit today, with, you know, with the site specific scale and the way that you look at where's your site?
Just a Stockton sand pit, so where the Stockton Bridge is, and then the sand spawned by that, and and how the birds somehow got there, and so I thought, because when I went there yesterday, there wasn't, because it felt like it was you know, it's a very inconspicuous, I suppose, and how, because I guess my real question is, if we were to build an infrastructure in such a sensitive area where the ecosystem is, you know, active, so you know, I guess what are the measures that we can take and how possible it is, and etc. and stuff like that. Yeah,
it's a great question. One of the chapters in that 2017 book, it's sort of based around this idea of design restraint, and I was going to include the slide today, but I didn't because it takes a bit too much time. But since you sort of raised it, there's this wonderful story in there for a wonderful landscape architect that I used to work under, and it's the story of when he was a student. They were set the brief of the Queen Victoria Market in Melbourne, having to redesign it, and in his final presentation he presented a series of sketches of the market as it is, and he said, this place has a soul, I don't want to change it. Why would I want to change it? And his director, you know, who wrote his obituary, worked with him, just said it was a real revelatory thing. So I think in that case, it's, you know, is it a case of, is not developing it, you know, the best approach, or to what extent can you support it? What measures do you take to enhance it? And that's where I think we need to bring our ego check in, you know, sometimes as humans and as designers, is do we need to intervene, or is it better not to intervene? It's like the you know, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. It's just an absolute haven of biodiversity. Same with the Iron Curtain through Europe, you know, with the sort of communist versus non-communist countries and powers. That was just an absolute haven of wildlife, and became a corridor in European subsequent corridors. So, you know, like some people will say to you, hey, that's a cop-out, but it isn't. It's up to you as a designer to present a compelling argument. You know, what we do doesn't always have to be a spatial design, but it should be a well-considered process, you know, and again, an argument or a storyteller. And this is where the reason I tell that story is Kevin Taylor was such a wonderful storyteller, and he could always captivate a room or an audience through telling a story of a design, and that involved, like I touched on, you know, an understanding of its history, its people, its current community, and just sort of threading all these things together and weaving them together. So, yeah, I mean, look, check with your course convener, or, you know, you got to sort of do something that they're comfortable with. But my advice is, think really strategically about what intervention is right, and in some cases it is no intervention, or it's a very light touch, you know. A few things here and there.
Okay, thank you so much.
No worries.
Yes, I have a question, because I'm kind of curious, and I didn't have the opportunity to read the book you were the editor in 2017, although I will do it.
Irene,
I
come
don't
on.
know. I don't know if you're still kind of researching in this area of agriculture and food, or this is something you have been spending some time and you are moving forward into another area. But essentially, my question is whether you can kind of make a reference, because I'm sure it's super interesting. I'm sure it's very valuable for the student, not particularly apply to their project, but the way in which eventually we have to focus, the way we will change our cities, and we will change the way we manage the landscape and the agricultural land, especially in a very, very delicate and sensitive landscape as the Australian one. So I think it's a topic internationally, because population is growing. We know that 1/3 of the total food production in the world go to garbage and landfill, which is terrible.
It is, yeah.
We also know that the agriculture in Australia is the product of colonization. People like Bruce Pascoe is talking about how we should go back to the original kangaroo grass and all the grains that were originally, because are going to enrich all these things that probably you are an expert and I don't have any knowledge, and I know the answer will take you hours and hours. If you can give some of the students, especially, I think, because look, I want to thank you because I have to move to a tutorial, but I want to thank you for the lecture because it's amazing. But I didn't thought it could be so useful for some of my students, because we are working in a scenario of 150 years and 3 generations, connecting 3 generations, line of Newcastle, and then the student decide their side and the brief, and they build their narrative, and they are now kind of speculating how the project are going to but then many of the points you have been touching are going to be very useful for them now in the future. So thank you very much. I didn't know it's going to be so accurate. But I think for Alex's student, it's going to be very useful, my kind of question. But I'm sure for many of my students as well, because how do we envision agriculture?
Yeah, no, thanks, Irene, and thank you for having me. And like you said, I can talk for hours and hours on that. So I'll try and keep it really short. But Jeff Park, who I quoted, near the start of the lecture, talks about, like you said, the legacy of our agriculture, colonized agriculture, as an extractive industry, and the fact that we don't necessarily think of it like that. And so, a lot of people talk about regenerative farming, but we're such a long way from that being a reality. And the reality is most of Australian agriculture is extractive, as you've mentioned, on an incredibly fragile, subcontinent with incredibly ancient soils and a lack of geological process, and sort of that fertility has been long eroded and blown away. But so bringing it back to the built environment, I mean, the ecological footprint is a way that I always like to conceive of how each of us as individuals has what is a very large area we require to furnish our lifestyles. And the largest area always relates to agriculture. And Richard Weller in Boomtown, it's got, I think I even know the page, 443, I think it is, 442, double page spread. And it shows a little house on a gigantic plot, to show that, the spatial extents of the ecological footprint to furnish, the average Australian household with all its goods. And then agriculture is the large proportion of that. And so that goes back to, like Alex mentioned, Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City in having a large area of agriculture associated with the city. Yeah, Ebenezer Howard similarly. And you got to think back, Ebenezer Howard around about 1900, the world population was 1 billion then, and it's now 7 billion. And the green revolution in agriculture, which is sort of badly named term because it's certainly not green, it's industrial agriculture, and they've now sort of rebranded that sustainable intensification. But and again, I'll go back to the quote here, this notion that the future is predetermined. And I was reading some articles just before I came on here, National Geographic, saying the world's population is going to be 9 billion. We need to double our food output, blah, blah, blah. Well, it isn't 9 billion. if it will become 9 billion if we choose it to become 9 billion, if we just continue business as usual. And so in some senses, I might be completely naive, but in another sense, it's this Bookchin quote, you know, that the future is sort of where we steer it in a sense. But like, that's why I've spent a couple of years writing this book on Sydney's agriculture, because what I found is thousands and thousands of past agricultural sites from, you know, ostrich farms and, you know, countless vineyards and so many dairies. You know, Marrickville was a touch point for them, and the Hills district, just, you know, so many orchards, and then cropping all along the Hawkesbury, you know, which is now turf, and grazing and dairy in Western Sydney, along with orcharding, and, you know, there's so many different kinds of land uses, and some really strange, weird one. Chinese market gardens, you know, being the sort of botany, being the vegetable bowl of Sydney. And so I think food to me, as someone who's spent a lot of time studying it, is sort of marginalized land use. And in Sydney's history, at least, it's got that historic legacy. It's always been pushed aside by urban development. We've never valued it as a land use. And it sort of relates to our thinking in Australia that we have this vast land mass and we can always grow it somewhere else, and we can always truck and ship it in from somewhere else. So there's a tension to the highest level of political decision-making, whereby I've had arguments with Rod Simpson, the former Environment Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission, about the need for there to be food production in Sydney. And, you know, he sort of doesn't buy the arguments. And so part of my motivation doing this research is sort of convince someone that it is important. And again, it relates to the time frame that we're thinking. Once you lose agricultural land in a metropolitan footprint, it's very hard to get it back. You're sure we could do indoor forms of agriculture, but actual agriculture in the ground, once it's built or lost to urban development, you know, it's not really reclaimable necessarily. So these decisions in, you know, rezoning agricultural land, you know, to greenfield development, you know, is largely irreversible, and therefore, you know, really important, I think, to be engaged in. But yeah, you touched upon, Irene, as well, the notion of, you know, Indigenous foods, and undoubtedly they're the ones adapted to the Australian landscape, which was shaped by 60,000 years of, you know, basically fire landscape management by Koori cultures. But then I also like to sort of say that, okay, when the first fleet arrived in 1788, the Aboriginal population in metropolitan Sydney was estimated at 3,000 to 4,000. You know, it's now over 5 million. So that sort of explains why we have industrial food systems in a sense. So that's why I'm doing that food scenarios project, to explore some of these big questions. And, you know, if we did have Indigenous food systems across Australia, how many people would it feed? You know, I don't know the answer to it. It's going to be interesting if I can, but these are the sort of scenarios that you got to play out, the questions you got to weigh up, and, you know, getting the big picture down to the small picture, and sort of marrying some of these bigger concepts in, you know, with your design concepts that are applied to a, you know, particular site or a brief, or, you know, how effective or meaningful that can be on a particular site. Is it the right approach or not? You know, part of that sort of story and narrative and analysis.
It's really interesting because you haven't shown before, or probably the first image you haven't shown when you present the section of design. You show, I don't remember the design name, but it was a project in Adelaide. We're showing 1863 and then 1924. I think he was, yeah, this one. It's a professor, isn't it? You said you're... Yeah. So some of the students, because we are working in this scenario of the 200, 150, 200 years, some of them has been working instead starting in the past and moving into the future, or starting nowadays and moving into the future. For some of them happens something similar to that, because essentially the climate change, for example, is disconnecting Stockton Island. What is Stockton today? Sea level rise happen as it is supposed to happen. It's going to be an island, the whole Stockton till Port Stephen. So one scenario can look very similar to the sand dune that you have there on the very bottom, and this kind of inverse evolution. So when you were mentioning about how many land do we need to move into a more sustainable model? This is really interesting because how much we should condense the cities or make denser and reduce the footprint and then increase or reverse all this land into what many people is researching about peri-urban agriculture that will make the system more sustainable, because if we are not consuming pineapples from Indonesia and I buy many products from Spain here in Australia in my Aldi supermarket, so, or in Harvest Farm, so, which is crazy, things that I cannot find there. So all this craziness, I think it's a fundamental debate, and that is for luck happening. But look, in Spain, for example, the agriculture model has been moving into ecological model in a very quick kind of time frame. So I think things can happen quicker than expected, and or no. So
yeah, and we got to be optimistic about that.
Your work is amazing. I think it's extremely necessary, and yeah.
Oh yeah, thank this. I mean, so Richard Register was the person behind this type of planning. If anyone wants to look up, Paul Downton's got a book, 2011, that has got this in it, and it's written up, you know, and talk. It's a great book, and it'll talk through some of Richard Register's thing. It's something I didn't touch on in this, which I can't recall because the terms change over time. But you know, part of the thinking of this is what we now call, I guess, ecosystem services. You know, traditionally we might call that carrying capacity, you know, or the ability for ecosystems to provision us with services such as, you know, clean water to, you know, to use in agriculture, you know, which requires, you know, revegetate or, you know, vegetated catchments. So I think that was all embedded in this process. Didn't make it explicit, but if anyone goes to the book, might be in your library. It's called Ecopolis, that book, and yeah, it's a really good one to connect this sort of large scale thinking.
Thank you, Josh. I move to the tutorial. Hopefully we can meet in person and continue the conversation, and hopefully we can invite you soon to the School of Architecture. Thank you.
Definitely, Irene. Thanks so much for having me.
Anyway, I have some of my students here that eventually will pop up and make you questions. And I leave on Alex's student because I'm taking like too much of your time. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.